As those of you familiar with tabletop wargames know, someone has to be the chaff, the little guy whose job it is to eat bullets so that someone more important doesn't have to worry about that kind of thing. It's a thankless task more often than not, and has the life expectancy of however long it takes for the enemy to get their first shot off. Arguably a necessary task, because at least in wargames there's units that plain and simple are just worth less than others and should be put in the line of fire, but that doesn't mean it's any less messed up. Maybe something like drones or Necron warriors aren't intelligent enough to warrant feeling bad, but when you're the guard and you're sacrificing dozens of dudes to keep the Baneblade safe, you are on some level doing some morally dark stuff. And over in Halo, there's of course the Grunts. When creating the Grunts, everyone involved must have been binging some 40k books about Forge Worlds or something, because the life of a Grunt is not the, by and large, fairly decent life humanity lives in Halo. It's not the savage tribalism of the brutes, the bloody but honorable and otherwise advanced society of the elites. It's not even the piracy of the jackals, where it's rough but they're pretty content to be there. The life of a Grunt is short, brutal, and quite frankly, it sucks. Before, during, and after the Covenant, you'd be hard-pressed to find a species treated with less respect. But despite all that, they're funny little guys, and that makes them lovable. So today, we talk about the Ungoi. Sure, they're pathetic little fellas, but that makes them all the more endearing. But since you're going to be listening to this video, how about I tell you a way to make your listening experience oh so much better? Raycon, the sponsor of this video. Traditional headphones are great for tuning out the world completely, but sometimes you can't quite shut the entire world out. Much as it's nice, sometimes you gotta pay a bit of attention. Well, luckily, Raycon's new bone conduction headphones are here to help. These are not a necromancer's ploy to take over the world, but instead they use sound vibration to bypass your eardrums completely. It's playing the sound directly to your bones, which is metal as hell and means you can listen to whatever you want loud and clear while still hearing the outside world. And since they're made with movement in mind, you can take them wherever you go without worrying about them slipping out. They're waterproof, dustproof, and have a 13-hour battery life, meaning wherever you're taking them, they'll stay strong the whole way through. I mostly use them when I'm putting minis together. Since I've recently acquired a Cathay army for Old World, I have once again several dozen hours of working on these things ahead of me. And Raycon's bone conduction headphones means I'll have quality sound while I work without having to worry about something like not hearing Athena when she starts barking her head off. If you train hard, sweat hard, or just want audio that fits your lifestyle, Raycon's bone conduction headphones are built for you. Go to buyraycon.com/pancreasnoworkbc to get 20% off your order of bone conduction headphones. No buds, just beats. Raycon Bone Conduction. Let your sound move with you. Now then, let the funny meat shields reign supreme. Grunts, or Ungoi for the proper non-human name for the species, are one of the many different aliens that were found within the Covenant during its existence. And as is standard for species in Halo, they existed well before the Covenant, at least as far back as the Forerunner Flood War. They weren't one of the particularly active species like humanity, the Forerunners, and the Prophets, but they were hanging around doing grunty things. According to the Forerunner technology tier system, they were a tier 4 civilization. It goes down as a civilization advances, and at their level, the Grunts had just about achieved the space age. While this wasn't proper interstellar civilization levels, they were able to travel at least their solar system with a good amount of reliability. No crazy advanced Halo tech, but certainly better than what we're at right now in real life. Of course, they chose the worst time to do this, because at about this point, the Flood were rampaging across the galaxy, and the Forerunners decided that nothing short of killing everyone inside of it was going to save existence. The Librarian and the other Lifeworker Forerunners scooped up all the ancient Ungoi they could, shoved them in the Ark and any other potential shelters from the rings, and then the fuse was lit and the rings went off. Everyone in the galaxy dies, everyone in the Ark and outside of it is reseated back into the galaxy, and it's a bit of a hard reset for everyone involved. Their homeworld, Balaho, was of course among these reseeded worlds. They began rebuilding their culture and civilization, but on account of the Forerunners disrupting their development even if it was to save them, they had fallen all the way back to a tier 6 society. All they were able to claw back up to was early industrial age tech, stuff we'd have around the year 1800 to maybe 1900. In fact, by the time the Covenant found them in the year 2142, they were noted as being particularly defenseless. Case in point, they were pretty much the only Covenant species outright forced into the Empire. Now, the Covenant were no strangers to gunboat diplomacy. The hunter worms were partially exterminated since some of them fed on Forerunner artifacts. But there was usually some good to go with the involuntary joining of the Covenant that outweighed it, arguably at least. Some mutual religious ties, nicer armor, and decent living conditions compared to what was before, protection from any outside threats. Aside from humanity, most aliens the Covenant found were at least gifted the chance to willingly join before the murder started happening. The Grunts did not get this courtesy. In fact, the Grunts didn't even get told told to join or die. Instead, they were told that they are now a part of the Covenant. Please enjoy all the manual labor you'll be doing for us from here on out. The fourth species inducted into the Empire, the Grunts would become the lowest rung of Covenant society. They had pretty much no respect given to them, and indeed initially Grunts weren't even given weapons if they ever saw combat. While they're obviously meat shields in the Halo games, Grunts initially were explicitly nothing more than that. In spite of this, the Grunts still took to the Covenant's faith in the Great Journey with gusto. Worshipping the Foreigners was not a tall ask for them, and basically the entire species quickly became some of their most devout worshippers. It may have had something to do with the fact that while they were treated like dirt, High Charity and other Covenant areas they were stationed at had the miracle of centralized heating. There was even a Grunt theologian, Agnapnap the Enlightened, who spread a belief amongst the Grunts that prior to their ascension, the Grunts and Foreigners looked identical. This is very, very wrong, but incredibly funny. It might also be a heresy to the Great Journey, but I imagine any prophets who learn of this just let it happen. It kept the Grunts happy, loyal, and anyone else could just quietly nod and then call the Grunts stupid behind their backs. Also, yes, all Grunt names are funny like that. It's like a law or something. For a little over 300 years, this was the position of Grunts in the Covenant hierarchy. Abused, sent in to do the worst manual labor, and thrown into the meat grinder of any battles the Covenant did face, it wasn't exactly a pleasant lifestyle. Naturally, this created a lot of resentment, and the boiling point came in the year 2462. The second lowest ranked species in the Covenant were the Kig-Yar, or for those of you who've recently gone through a Halo 2 Legendary run, those goddamn asshole sniping jackals. Treated only marginally better than Grunts, they were also relegated to the less prominent areas of High Charity and dirtier work. This caused plenty of tension between them as they fought over scraps and rubbed up against one another's territory. Not helping things is that, as I'll discuss later, Grunts breed like rabbits. Discussing the breeding habits of fictional aliens is part of my job. Never thought my life would take me here. Anyways, because there wasn't much in the way of active combat going on, the Grunt population expanded rapidly. This ended up pushing some of the jackals out of their homes as the Grunts needed more and more space, which caused jackal infant mortality rate to rise and stressed out the mothers. In response, the jackals started poisoning some recreational drugs the Grunts enjoyed in a way that left them infertile. The matter was brought to the attention of the Covenant High Council and the Prophets, but they responded with a very blunt "who gives a shit." They didn't feel like upsetting the Kig-Yar over what they saw as a trivial cost, because to them, thousands of Grunts that can't have kids was nothing to worry about. The Grunts could replace any potential kids in like a month tops, who cares? The Grunts were not pleased with this. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they went ballistic. They started swarming across jackal-controlled territory, and not long after, they just started throwing hands with anyone they came across. Didn't matter who it was, jackal, elite, hell, they were probably taking pot shots at prophets if they got the chance. Now, obviously, they were horribly outmatched. They weren't allowed to have weapons in combat zones. They wouldn't have much of anything here. But have you ever felt that rush of fear in Halo when you turn a corner and see a Grunt with 2 prime plasma grenades running at you? Imagine that, only now it's an elite turning a corner and seeing 100 of them. Millions, if not billions, of Grunts descended across Covenant facilities. Because they were the main source of manual labor, they were across pretty much the entire Covenant, and so almost as one, Grunts began assaulting everything they could. I can't help but imagine that one scene in World War Z where the zombies are climbing the walls with their bodies, only with Grunts instead. It got so bad that the Prophets felt the need to appoint an elite as an arbiter to resolve the issue. He did manage to solve the issue through the classic Covenant method though, glassing the planet causing the problems. Not completely, but a decent hunk of Balaho was glassed, and the Grunts quickly surrendered afterwards. They didn't actually give a shit about Balaho itself, but there were a whole lot of Grunts on the planet, and it was where a lot of the Grunt breeders were located. In spite of the rebellion, the Grunts were not exterminated as a species, but instead got a lot of rewards. They weren't humans, and so weren't inherently unclean, and the viciousness they showed in the war made the elite see them in higher regard than ever. They showed that when push came to shove, the Ungoi could be fierce fighters, and that while not as physically imposing as most others, could still put their money where their mouth was. And so, despite being defeated, the Grunts were rewarded with a variety of benefits, such as the honor of being able to actually have weapons and training for combat now. How amazing. They were also integrated into elite units going forward, which is admittedly pretty big given the superiority complex elites have. This was something the elites won against the Prophets to do, because the Covenant's founding charter declared elites have the final say when it comes to anything related to the Covenant's military and security. The Prophets wanted stricter punishment, but the elites know that real recognizes real and gave the little guys some consolation prizes. It wasn't an overall upgrade in status, though. Their representation on the High Council wasn't any less functionally powerless than it was before, and they were still absolutely meat shields when it came to combat. But when they were previously unarmed and armored meat shields, I think they were willing to take anything they could get. Also, fun fact, the person who brought the jackal poisoning of the Grunts to the High Council was a prophet named Ord Casto, aka the Prophet of Truth. He argued repeatedly that the entire affair was wrong and that no one was taking it seriously enough, whereupon his political career was threatened by others to make him shut up. Kind of insane that out of everyone who could have been trying to help the Grunts out, Truth was the one to do it. That'd be like if the staunchest supporter of abhuman rights in 40k was a Black Templar. Now, the Grunts from here on out were pretty much how they were at in the Covenant when the Human-Covenant War broke out. There were a few more rebellions, one of which was put down by the Arbiter from Halo Wars, but the Covenant still needed its manual labor, so they always stuck around. Come the Human-Covenant War, you can actually to some extent blame a Grunt on the war breaking out. When the Covenant first met with humanity on Harvest, it was with a diplomatic meeting that was headed by a brute of all things. Things were tense, but it wasn't necessarily going to break out into combat. Then a Grunt who was a little bit trigger-happy fired on a human and killed him, and then one thing led to another, and it's time for humanity to get fisted up to the eyeballs with an energy sword. The Grunts throughout the conflict were still the meat shields, but for once they had found an enemy that wasn't going to be throwing plasma at them in response. Sure, compared to the rest of the Covenant, the Grunts were easy to fight, and when you had a Spartan around, they were getting folded like lawn chairs. Hell, in the Babysitter episode of Halo Legends, there's a Grunt that gets its neck snapped by an ODST who must be like 20 feet tall. But they were still armed with Covenant weaponry. Plasma weapons, fuel rod guns, things that tore apart their human equivalents with ease. Sometimes Grunts alone in enough numbers could overrun entire human regiments, and even if they all died, they played the role of meat shields well. Shooting the Grunts means not dealing with the elite or brute leading them, and shooting at those guys means 10 Grunts are now going to aim their weapons on you. They may be crap shots, but 10 plasma pistols pointed in your general direction will eventually hit something important. There was even an army of Grunts put together by a jackal on the Prophet of Truth's orders that was told to try and invade Earth itself fairly early in the war. It didn't work, and the entire affair was mildly amusing, because it was stopped by both human insurrectionists as well as elite zealots who didn't have the full story and thought the Grunts were up to some heresy. But to me at least, it shows the Grunts could be trusted with important campaigns on some level. And again, it was the Prophet of Truth doing this, so the motivations behind it range from genius plot to wipe out humanity to these creatures have bothered me, I must have them killed for nothing. Interestingly enough, however, Grunts had another surprisingly critical role in the war, monitoring human communications. Admittedly, they were largely in charge of monitoring for communications rather than going over them, but that's still a big thing. This led them to, among other things, being surprisingly well versed in human languages, with many Grunts being at least passingly proficient at a couple different ones. There's a lot of actual human beings who can't say that today. It also caused them to develop a black market of human culture, because for one reason or another, they found themselves big fans of it. TV shows, movies, and more were secretly traded amongst the Grunts as they gushed about their favorite human media away from the eyes of their commanders. For a disturbing mental image, this makes the alien most likely to own a body pillow the Ungoi. Enjoy that mental picture I've just put in your mind, because I certainly don't. It's a nice lore reason the Grunts have almost always spoken in English, though. Turns out the Grunts you massacre in Combat Evolved might have been really big human weebs. As the war went on, the Grunts were kept in this role, occasionally getting glimpses of human culture and being abused by pretty much everyone. Except the engineers, but the engineers were biological computers designed by the Forerunners. Prejudice didn't really factor into them, because for one reason or another, engineers were designed to be lovable teddy bear octopus things. Or if you're me playing ODST for the first time, enemies you gun down without a second thought, because if the reticle was red, the target had to be made dead. Also, the Grunts may have eaten people on some occasions, but that's neither here nor there, don't worry about it. As the war came to a close and the Covenant Civil War occurred, the Grunts found themselves in an awkward position. See, they were fervent believers in the Great Journey, arguably the most dedicated out of all the Covenant races. On the other hand, they're pretty cowardly most of the time. So which side they supported, be that the Covenant or the elites, was entirely up to whoever was commanding them at the time. Independence and or the Great Journey are all well and good, but you don't survive for either if you walk up to the lizard/ape in charge of your squad and tell him you disagree with his plans. You mostly just get killed. After the war, the Grunts were one of the few races in Halo that were arguably in a better spot than they were before. Aside from the massive amounts of casualties they incurred, of course, but everyone lost billions during the Human Covenant War, so that's not even worth thinking about. Few of them went back home because Flollo sucks. Most instead continued working under whoever they were serving with beforehand, elite and brute alike. You could find grunts in pretty much everywhere that was the site of former Covenant facilities, and in fact you could even find a couple of the little guys wandering around human colonies of all places. True, they did face prejudice much the same way other former Covenant members did. Turns out a generation-long war of extermination leaves some hurt feelings. But grunts are also funny little goobers with names like Yap Yap. You can only hold a grudge against someone like that for so long. Some of them even found that with the war over and the hierarchy of the Covenant dissolved, they could take positions of power never before seen. In Halo Infinite, there's of course that grunt field boss whose name is Bip-Bap, and amongst elites they could sometimes be found leading squads of Sangheli rather than the other way around. The grunts didn't enter some grand renaissance of culture and prosperity or anything, but a lot of them did get an overall boost in a whole lot of areas. While I never saw it explicitly written down anywhere, I'd even be willing to bet they were hurt the least by the degradation of the Covenant's infrastructure. As the ones doing most of the menial labor in the Covenant, the grunts would likely be more aware of how to operate the lower key but practical devices the Covenant had for things like construction and whatnot. While the elites and brutes had to contend with relearning how to build new starships, the grunts could happily wander off and live the rest of their days doing whatever goofy crap they wanted. At the very least, they can't have gotten any worse off than before, because they were at the bottom of the barrel and the Covenant refused to give them the equipment to dig themselves any deeper a hole. The grunts have entered a galaxy that by and large doesn't seem to want to enslave them or require their help in a big way. They're just kind of ignored. Flollo is quiet, with literally nothing coming or going from it. They're watched in case any massive movement of the buggers occurs. Oni isn't going to leave anyone unmonitored, but no one has plans to invade the grunts and put them in chains once again. Except for Cortana in Halo 5, but we all ignore that. Slight lie in the title here, because I'll talk about more than just culture and biology, but hey, that's more video for you, so don't complain. We'll start with the biology first, because even I can only talk about how aliens have sex for so long. Grunts are an absolute mess of a species, with the traits of like a dozen different categories of animal. Initially, they were believed to be arthropods, because they've got a chitinous exoskeleton. Turns out, no, they're vertebrae with DLC. While they're perfectly capable of walking upright, and you've probably seen them running with their hands waving around plenty often in Halo, they oftentimes prefer to run on all fours like a gorilla. In spite of being as goofy looking as they are, they have incredible reflexes and a good amount of dexterity. They're suited for climbing whatever's in front of them, and they can pull the trigger on a plasma pistol as fast as a plasma rifle fires. Another cool detail explaining how on legendary difficulty these dicks fire faster than the SMG does. Their outer shells are reminiscent of crabs and or insects, and overall the grunt's biology is like if you hit shuffle on a spore creature a few dozen times. Also, have you ever played Halo and thought they're kinda cute in the way a pug is cute? Well, here's what they look like without the mask or any armor and clothing. God must be real in the Halo universe, and his greatest prank was making grunts look like that. There's a subspecies with less chitin on their bodies, which is Halo once again introducing new phenotypes to explain art style changes. It's cool they do that. Grunts are also, despite how they look, able to be up to almost 6 feet in height. Seriously, if you get a chance, look at them standing next to a Marine in one of the Halo games. They're nearly the same height, and grunts actually weigh about 250 pounds on average. They're built like brick shithouses, which is part of why when you corner them like a rat, they're able to fight so effectively. For breeding, because I feel obligated at this point with how much I've mentioned it, grunts come out as eggs in batches of potentially over a dozen at once. They become fully grown adults around 8 years old, and despite aging to maturity so quickly, they can actually live to be well over 100. The grunt Yap Yap was 121 years old in the year 2559, which means he predated the start of the Human Covenant War year by almost 100 years. Their homeworld of Flollo sucks. It's miserable. It's swampy, and a whole lot of the planet is suffering from massive industrial pollution, from the grunts trying to claw their way back to having technology. The swamps are also freezing cold, with the average temperature being around negative 27 degrees Fahrenheit. The equator is a bit better, but still miserable, and because the planet somehow has 2 winters, the Ungoi population is in a constant state of flux. The already cold planet becomes even worse in winter, with the grunts desperately having to hunt and gather any food they can to prevent total starvation. Massive amounts of them die to the cold, to the point that they have a name for it because it's so common: the Blue Death. They live a tribal lifestyle largely led by matriarchs, since they're the ones that make more grunts, or at least that's what I assume the reason is, and I really can't impart on you enough how miserable this planet is. And not in a fun sci-fi death world kind of way, it just sucks. Oh, and some of it is glass after the Grunt Rebellion. That's what happens when you send in an arbiter who isn't Keith David to solve your problems. Of course, the struggles don't end there. The atmosphere of Flollo is mostly methane, so whenever the grunts leave it, they need to carry around breathing masks and those massive pyramid tanks tanks on their backs so they don't asphyxiate everywhere else they go. Some of them leave their awful homeworld behind, only to find out most other species consider your version of oxygen to be fart gas. Incidentally, most humans think grunts smell largely of shit and vomit for this reason, which probably doesn't help the prejudice they may face off-world. I'm sorry, Yap Yap, but you don't have aura, you just smell. You can hit them and they explode, and while I've never actually watched them run around suffocating long enough to find out, I have to imagine that if not in gameplay, then at least in-universe, they're gonna slowly suffocate to death afterwards. Those tanks can also be explosive, as many a poor bastard in Halo Reach has found out on a legendary run. When they go to eat, they have what's called a food nipple, which they sometimes talk about in-game. No, you will not be seeing titties in this YouTube video, it's a machine that dispenses flavorless nutrient paste. The grunts don't really like it, but feeding time is one of the only times they aren't being beaten or sent out to die to the Master Chief, so it's one of the few pleasures they actually have. It's not all miserable breathing problems for them though. Turns out they can spike their methane tanks with something called infusions. It's drugs. That's what it is. It's drugs they regularly take. They take it so frequently that the jackals poisoning the infusions led them to be sterile on a mass level. They just pump it right into their methane tanks, which they need to breathe. Given that they like human culture, which presumably includes music, I hope one day we get lore of a grunt speeding down High Charity on a ghost, absolutely blitzed out of his mind on infusions and blasting Kickstart My Heart the whole way. They can also get high off benzene. It's worth noting that in real life, benzene gives you cancer. Who the hell made grunts? All the other Halo species are pretty easy to understand and see how they work. Elites are warrior lizards, brutes are angry monkeys, jackals are pirate birds. Grunts are what happens when you hit I'm feeling lucky on evolution. During their stay in the Covenant, they held a pretty small variety of opinions on the other races. Prophets were revered, as they were by pretty much everyone except the elites. Everyone else was hated out of fear. It was even believed that one day a grunt savior would lead them to a paradise world. Paradise here meaning a methane planet that isn't freezing cold at all times. Most of what they did on the regular was orders given to them by higher-ups, which was everyone. Usually those orders amounted to lift that box, or press that button when X happens, because no one thinks highly of grunt capabilities. Their language is mostly squeaking and grunting, and their names are either the most basic syllables they could think of, or utter nonsense. They do, in some slight bit of credit for a species that has dozens of kids and hopes one of them lives to adulthood, feel attachment towards their offspring and families. Unfortunately, during their time in the Covenant, the grunts would be pressed into mandatory military service almost immediately. And because they reproduce so quickly, there were laws in place during peacetime to keep you from having kids. So if you weren't at war, no kids for you. And if you were at war, your kids are born to get shelled by artillery. Being a grunt truly is suffering. In the military, after the Covenant came to recognize that grunts are in fact sapient and can be trusted with firearms, there was of course a variety of different roles they had. Meat shield was the common theme throughout all of them, but there were different kinds of meat shield. Grunt minor is the average grunt, literally and figuratively. They're the orange, tannish colored grunts that are the lowest ranked and as such are given the worst weapons and armor. They die quick, and all they have are plasma pistols and needlers. Powerful weapons in the right circumstances and perfectly capable of taking down a marine, but certainly still the lowest end of the Covenant hierarchy. Grunt majors are much redder in their armor's color, and while occasionally armed with better weapons, they still aren't anything worth worrying about. They can command other grunts and are slightly braver than most of their brethren, but it's like the Skaven. The slightly braver Skaven is still a coward, just not quite as cowardly as the rats around him. That's what a grunt major is. Grunt ultras are when the grunt in question is more likely to stand and fight than not, and they even have actual real armor now. They command other grunts with actual bravery behind them, even if it'll falter when something like a Spartan shows up. I won't criticize them much for that though, because anyone would falter when a Spartan comes running at them. Their armor even lets them tank something like a DMR round to the face before they go down, which is pretty impressive even by non-grunt standards. Some more specialized roles exist as you would expect too. Grunt heavies are grunt heavy weapons guy. When you have a fuel rod cannon, it's easy to be brave. Storm grunts are grunt stormtroopers, deployed alongside troops like elites during spec op missions. Grunt rangers float around in space, and Imperial grunts are veterans of the Human Covenant War that have found themselves in a fairly prominent military position in some group or other. Could be the Banished, could be some Covenant remnants on Helios, or just random bands of assholes in space. There's also the Grunt Deacon. It's the single lowest rank in the Covenant political hierarchy, and the only one attainable by grunts. It has basically no real power, a grunt trying to get his way away with anyone above him will be ignored at best and probably killed at worst, and it overall is a position of zero importance. Nevertheless, a deacon will bolster the fighting spirit of any nearby grunts, and indeed they'll be stationed around the Covenant for this purpose. It makes him feel proud. A lowly grunt was able to make it to a political position, even if it's one that doesn't actually matter. They're knowledgeable in the Covenant faith and do technically have a duty to supervise any other Covenant members on matters of faith, but no one who isn't a grunt actually takes them seriously. Even when they make it to the big leagues, no one cares for the humble Ungoi. Most of the time, they're subservient to whatever commanding species they follow. If they follow a Sangheili commander, they'll be a bit more reserved and almost tactical. Even if their tactics usually end at try not to get shot at, there'll be some amount of training and discipline among these ones. Elites did come to respect them after all, so they'll be utilized properly to at least some degree. By contrast, brutes are stupid apes, and so they command their grunt underlings like stupid apes. This is when the grunts are truly utilized as meat shields, and while the brutes certainly think less of the grunts, it's not even necessarily out of prejudice that they utilize grunts this way. Brutes just want to get in and start fighting, and so they tell their grunt minions to do the same alongside them. This is one of those magical instances in fiction where someone mistreats their underlings not purely out of intent, but because they're so stupid that's just what they think they should do. They're pretty much all cowardly though, of course. When you shoot whoever's commanding them in the head, all the grunts around will scatter and flee in random directions. Sometimes they'll rally and put up a fight, but usually they have been killed by the time that happens. Of course, as you probably know, sometimes they rally a bit too hard. They see the commander go down, make the logical assumption that they're next, and decide to dive into the great journey head first. In these cases, they pull out 2 plasma grenades and arm them, which fuses the grenade to their skin at the atomic level, and then charge at whoever's the leader. If you see this threat coming, you can shoot them and laugh. If you don't see them coming because you let them out of your sight or just rounded a corner and they decided suicide bombing was the opening act, you are likely to explode. In this way can the Master Chief, representing not only trillions of dollars of military research but also the last hope for mankind, be taken out by a dude who may very well be 10 years old. Fitting, really. A child soldier takes out the child soldier. They clearly don't want to be in combat. In spite of their bravery when forced to be brave, they avoid fighting at all costs and only fight because someone above them is forcing them to. Quite frankly, they didn't want to be a part of the damn war, and since they have a black market of human artifacts, they likely don't even feel that bad about humanity. Sure, they're fervent followers of the Great Journey, and the Prophet said humanity is evil, so they went along with it, but I can't imagine that hate was all that deep in their hearts, otherwise they wouldn't gossip over the 26th century version of Big Brother or some other reality TV show. In short, biologically speaking, grunts are bug crab monkey people that breathe farts. Culturally speaking, once upon a time they had spaceflight, then the foreigners killed everyone, then the grunts reached their industrial revolution and ruined their planet. Militarily speaking, they are thrown at a bunker and told to either clog it with their bodies or pray to the forerunners the elite in charge can destroy the machine guns before it kills the grunts. You'll be hard-pressed to find a species more worse off than these guys, short of perhaps the average person born in the Imperium of Man or anyone born in the Xeela universe. I'm proud of that segment change title, screw you. Anyways, I figured to end off we'd go over some of the more prominent grunts. This is entirely because I think the grunts can have a surprising amount of characterization for mob enemies, and not at all because saying grunt names out loud makes me giggle. Let's start with our brave hero, Yayap. Yayap was a grunt during the events of Halo Combat Evolved, and this should tell you everything you need to know. He was born on Balaho and spent most of his time as a sentry and high charity in the lower districts, meaning he probably spent most of his time dealing with jackal muggers. Come the events of Combat Evolved, he was part of one of the boarding parties that raided the Pillar of Autumn. When he and his party of grunts found an elite that had been incapacitated by the Master Chief by way of bullet to the head, they rescued him and took him to a dropship to be taken back for medical help. Not out of respect for a superior officer, of course not. If they took him to the dropship, that would mean they would all get to leave with him. Unfortunately for him, this elite, whose name was Zuka, decided that Yayap would make a good replacement for his last one who had died. Yayap wasn't pleased with this, but there was literally nothing he could do, so he reluctantly started following the elite around like a little brother. Zuka, who had developed an understandable hate boner for the chief on account of being shot in the head, dedicated the remainder of the book Halo the Flood to either trying to get permission to chase Chief around or actually chasing Chief around. Yayap's part in this was to get beaten up by Zuka and left next to a ruined ghost so that UNSC Marines would capture him as a prisoner and he could activate a tracking device. This succeeded, but the attack on the Marine base was a failure because Yayap had been forced into a Tom and Jerry skit for the entire duration of Combat Evolved. Zuko briefly impersonated a dead elite commando for reasons that would surely get him closer to the Master Chief, and they returned to the Pillar of Autumn to get Yap some more methane. When they got there, they were put in charge of a group of jackals, and because Zuko was committing identity theft, he laid low and let Yap do all the hard work. The jackals hated the Grunt for commanding them, and then Yap saved them from some flood, which made them think of him as an honorary jackal. With such an illustrious position gained, Yap was then told to monitor for signs of the Master Chief. Yap found the chief, told Zuko where he was located, and then decided he had enough. The humans were beating their ass, the flood were here which was a nightmare all on its own, and his liege was a dickhead. He took a day's worth of food, some spare methane, and then hijacked a ghost and just drove off from the Pillar of Autumn. Supposedly he found some peace in his solitude, and it's at least a little impressive he avoided any sentinels, other covenant, and the flood. His last sights were the Pillar of Autumn exploding, and then he died when the Halo Ring exploded. For Zuko's part, he has two different possible deaths. In the novelization of Combat Evolved, the Master Chief knocked him out of his turret with grenades, and Cortana sent the elevator he arrived in tumbling down the shaft, which broke his spine when it crashed. In the game, he and some grunts pop out of an elevator, and then you blow them away like Breaking Benjamin without even thinking about it. I like Yap on all levels. On a meta level, he exists because when Halo the Flood was being written, Bungie didn't want any newly created characters to survive past the book so that they couldn't mess with the lore. So the author created this Looney Tunes duo of a grunt and an elite that are constantly trying to kill the Master Chief and failing because he's the Master fucking Chief out of a single black armored elite that's just a random enemy. That's just a really fun story. In the book, it's easy to relate to him because his life is endless suffering and slapstick shenanigans forced upon him. It's compelling to read about, makes you feel for the guy. And finally, his name is funny, and his relatives and friends' names are funny too. He had a cousin that served during the Battle of Harvest. His name was Bapap. He had a friend in that initial boarding party too. His name was Gaga. Zuko was kind enough to let Yap say goodbye to Gaga before becoming his assistant. These names make me feel like a toddler. Our next grunt on the list is Dadab. You know how Maze Hughes in Fullmetal Alchemist figures out the plot of the show before we even get to episode 10 and then dies for it? That's kinda what Dadab does. Dadab was a friend of an engineer, already a rarity among any Covenant species, and was a deacon aboard the Covenant ship the Minor Transgression, which was a jackal privateer ship used to search for foreigner artifacts. Instead, it became the first Covenant vessel to meet humanity when the jackals found a human cargo hauler and tried to attack it. Imagine being a truck driver in the Midwest and then one day you get mugged by aliens. Anyways, poor Dadab was the first Covenant member to see a human, who responded to his presence by trying to beat the poor grunt to death. His engineer buddy, named Lighter Than Some, saved him by beating the human to death with a rock. Not long after, or at least I don't think it was long after, because admittedly I read Contact Harvest like a decade ago, Dadab reads the luminary used to find foreigner artifacts and finds Harvest lighting up like a Christmas tree. Millions of foreigner artifacts all over the place. The Holy Grail had been found. Of course, as you may know, those weren't artifacts. They were humans, which register as reclaimers on luminaries. Since the glyph for reclaimer was mistranslated as reclamation, poor Dadab got a first-hand view before anyone else on the Covenant's religion being false. At one point as Contact Harvest's story goes on, he's standing by a wounded grunt by the name of Bapap. Yep, Yap's cousin is here now. Dadab considered him one of the most prominent members of the flock. Tartarus the Brute came along, and when Dadab pleaded with the chieftain to save his friend, he shot Bapap with a spiker and killed him. This set Dadab on the path to radicalization. Throughout the battle, Dadab's faith is also tested, as Lighter Than Some commits a bit of heresy by trying to make peace with humans on Harvest. Dadab keeps trying to tell him that's not right, but the engineer is stubborn about it, since they're friendly little guys. Before that conflict could go anywhere, though, Lighter Than Some was killed by a group of drones who were jealous of the engineer's ability to be an engineer. Dadab responded by going absolutely berserk, killing the entire bunch of the insects before setting his sights on Tartarus the Brute. He knew he was gonna die doing this, but he didn't care. He killed the bugs who slaughtered his floating octopus buddy, and he'd be damned if he didn't try and avenge Bapap too. During a battle against some Harvest soldiers, Dadab charged his plasma pistol to the max and fired a shot at Tartarus. Tartarus smashed the grunt into paste for the attack on his person, but he was forced to retreat because the attack knocked down his shields. Dadab knew he was going to die, but he hoped that if the humans could kill Tartarus afterwards, he'd have done all he could. It was unsuccessful, but there's a fun bit of lore here. Sergeant Johnston was present during this fight, and wondered why the grunt fired at his chieftain's back. He thought the shot was meant for him at first, but thinking back, that wasn't so. Flash forward 30 years to Halo 2, and none other than Sergeant Johnson is present for Tartarus' death at the Arbiter's hands. Since Johnson made an alliance with the Arbiter at the end of the game, you can argue that Dadab's final wish was granted in a roundabout way. Either way, foreigners bless you, Dadab the Deacon. You were too pure for this world, and may you and your engineer buddy find peace in the afterlife. Our next grunt is Quessass, who I'm going to call K because if I say his full name too many times, I fear you two will hit me with a demonetization hammer. K is featured in the book Ghost of Onyx, and while he's part of a human character's shining moment of awesome, his fate is pretty sad. K and his tribe of grunts were trained as many others were in the art of listening for any human communications he could find. They were, however, forbidden from learning how to read human language, which would become problematic for him later on. He was in charge of maintaining a storage subdeck on a Covenant cruiser, and after the fall of Reach, K was wandering around one day doing grunt things when he decided he wanted to take a hit of benzene. Take the edge off things, you know? He just survived the fall of Reach, cut the guy some slack. He's earned his narcotics. Upon snooping around, though, K found some engineers fretting over some human gizmos, one of which looked particularly special. This sparked K's curiosity, and he went over to investigate, poking around till something interesting happened. Eventually, he succeeded. From this device, a recorded message from UNSC Vice Admiral Danforth Whitcomb began playing, hallowed be his mustache, informing K that he sincerely hoped the Nova bomb K was poking around with would send a whole lot of Covenant straight to hell. It took K a couple of listens of the message to get the gist of it, since he wasn't that proficient with human language, but eventually he figured it out and started panicking. Unfortunately, at this time, the control panel of the bomb shorted out and it deactivated. You may be wondering, how is the bomb deactivating totally a bad thing? That's because when it shorted out, it gained the attention of every engineer in the cargo bay, who by their nature of being literally biologically designed to tinker with and fix things, swarmed the disassembled bomb to make sure it worked right again. They didn't know what it was, they just knew thing broke, and they wanted to make thing not broke. K desperately tried to stop them from activating it, but he couldn't get through the swarm of engineers before they succeeded. The entire affair went a little something like this. It's a bomb! Now, the incident is kinda funny, and also a nice bit of humanity, hell yeah, because the Nova bomb took down hundreds of Covenant ships, a massive space station, a moon, and a good chunk of a planet when it blew up. I, however, do not feel joy when reading about the explosion. Not at first, anyways, because we get K's point of view when it blows up, and for extra poignancy, here it is word for word. Quessass pushed his way through the throng of Huragok. He had to get to the thing and pull those wires. There was a flash of beautiful light and more glorious heat than he'd ever... And then it cuts mid-sentence because the force of a supernova just washed over him. All my man K ever wanted was to be warm. He missed Balajo, but he had a special hatred of the cold after he lost almost all of his friends and family to the Blue Death. His earliest memories were watching his loved ones freeze to death around him. Even if he didn't have the words to describe it, this poor grunt wanted nothing more in life than to cozy up beside a fire with a blankie and some hot chocolate, and maybe just a little bit of grunty heroin. Pour one out for K, viewer. May he forever be fuzzy and warm in whatever afterlife the grunts believe in. And those are the grunts. In universe, they're unloved, unappreciated, and now they're basically completely ignored by anyone, save the occasional grunt that manages to lead some banished troops or something. But I love you, grunts. I love these silly methane-breathing goobers. It wouldn't be Halo without one of them timidly wondering if the Master Chief is still around before you come screaming out of the bushes with a gravity hammer at one. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the grunts to my covenant, the ones doing all the behind-the-scenes work to keep things going. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Oh, there's also a grunt in Halo 5 whose name was Kit Pitlimp. He tried to get either a Prometheum Knight or the Warden Eternal to worship him as a god. He died for the trouble. See, if Halo 5 was just a game about grunts doing goofy shit like that, we all wouldn't have hated it. Also, that name is just perfect. Kit Pitlimp. I hope whoever came up with that got a raise or at least a free round of drinks.